A Dutch cloth merchant named Anthony van Leeuwenhoek pointed a homemade microscope at a drop of pond water in 1665 and discovered something that terrified him. Thousands of tiny creatures were swimming and dividing and competing for space in ways that looked almost strategic, and he called them animalcules because he had no other word for what he was seeing. 3 centuries later, a Chinese software engineer named Zhang Yiming would build a $400 billion company using the exact same discovery. The bacteria had already figured out viral growth, and Zhang Yiming just translated it into code. Most people assume TikTok's success comes from the algorithm, that it's about timing or trends or hashtags or some secret formula buried in ByteDance's Beijing headquarters. But the platforms that achieve explosive and sustained growth, like TikTok and early Instagram and Vine before Twitter killed it, aren't running on marketing principles at all. They're running on bacterial colonization strategies. The same mechanics that let a single Escherichia coli become 1 billion cells in 8 hours are the same mechanics that took TikTok from 0 to 1 billion users in 4 years. And once you understand how bacteria actually spread, you'll never approach content strategy the same way again. What happens at the scale of micrometers explains what happens at the scale of global platforms, and that's why microbial ecology matters here. When a bacterium lands on a new surface, whether that's a kitchen counter or the lining of your gut or a surgical implant, it doesn't just start reproducing randomly because that would be suicide. First, it runs a calculation. Microbiologists call this quorum sensing, a term they coined while studying how bacteria coordinate collective behavior. The bacterium releases chemical signals called autoinducers into its environment, molecules so small that 10 million of them would fit on a period at the end of this sentence, and then it measures how many bounce back. The question it's asking is simple. How many of us are here? Is this colony viable? Should I invest energy in reproduction, or should I wait? This matters because the bacterium won't commit resources until it knows it has a quorum, meaning a minimum viable population that can sustain growth. Below that threshold, individual bacteria stay dormant and conserve energy. Above it, they explode into coordinated action, and the switch is binary with no gradual ramp-up. Bonnie Bassler's laboratory at Princeton has spent decades studying this phenomenon, publishing foundational work in journals like Cell and Nature. Her research on Vibrio fischeri, the bioluminescent bacteria that live in symbiosis with Hawaiian bobtail squid, showed that these organisms only produce light when their population density crosses a specific threshold of roughly 10 to the 8th power cells per milliliter. One bacterium glowing alone would waste energy and hit an evolutionary dead end. 1 billion bacteria glowing together creates the brilliant blue light that squid use to eliminate their shadows while hunting at night, and the collective behavior only emerges when the numbers justify it. Marine biologists who first documented this were just trying to figure out why certain squid glow, which seemed like a narrow question with no relevance beyond cephalopod biology. They had no idea they were describing the growth engine behind every successful social platform that would exist a century later. Bacteria don't limit themselves to sensing their own kind, and they also run what's called interspecies communication. Different bacterial species release different autoinducers, and sophisticated bacteria can read multiple chemical languages at the same time. The questions they're asking go beyond how many of us are here to include, how many of them are here too, what's the competition like, and what's the opportunity cost of action. Pseudomonas aeruginosa, the bacterium responsible for deadly hospital-acquired infections, handles this calculation with particular ruthlessness. It monitors the population density of competing species and times its attacks to moments when rivals are weak. Biofilms, those slimy protective layers you find on rocks in streams or inside catheters, only form when conditions favor collective action. Too early and it wastes resources, too late, and competitors have already claimed the territory. Zhang Yiming understood this, maybe not consciously, and maybe not in biological terms. But when he built Douyin in 2016, the Chinese app that would become TikTok, he designed a system that runs quorum sensing on every piece of content millions of times per second. When you post a video on TikTok, the For You page algorithm doesn't immediately blast it to millions of people because that would be the equivalent of a bacterium burning all its energy on reproduction before knowing if the environment can sustain it. TikTok does what bacteria figured out 1 billion years ago. It runs a viability test. Your video gets shown to a tiny initial batch, and ByteDance engineers reportedly call this cold start testing, which involves maybe 200 to 500 people selected to represent different audience segments. The system measures how they respond by tracking watch-through rate, replay frequency, share ratio, and comment velocity. These are your autoinducers. When the signals come back strong enough and the metrics cross threshold, the algorithm decides this content has reached quorum and is viable. That's when the system floods resources into distribution, and your video goes from 500 views to 50,000 to 5 million. But here's the thing about weak initial signals. The algorithm does what bacteria do, which is conserve resources and move on. Your video dies in obscurity, while the system tests other content instead. This explains why Douyin achieved 600 million daily active users in China before TikTok even launched in the United States. The quorum sensing mechanism had already been battle-tested, and the bacteria had already proven the model worked. Epidemiologists have a parallel concept called R0, the basic reproduction number. A virus with R0 below 1.0 dies out because each infected person infects fewer than one other person, which breaks the chain. A virus with R0 above 1.0 spreads exponentially. Content has an R0 too, and TikTok's algorithm calculates the R0 of every video in real time. Cross threshold and you get exponential distribution. Fall short and you get extinction. What most creators don't realize is that TikTok's entire recommendation engine functions as a massive quorum sensing network. Each video acts as a bacterium. Each user's feed represents a potential colonization site, and the algorithm constantly measures which content has crossed threshold, in which microenvironments before replicating successful variants into new territories. The second bacterial principle that explains TikTok's dominance is horizontal gene transfer. And this one breaks everything you think you know about originality. Classical genetics says organisms pass genes vertically from parent to offspring. Your DNA came from your parents, who got it from their parents, extending back through an unbroken chain of ancestry. Bacteria cheat this system entirely. They share genes horizontally between individuals who aren't related at all, and a bacterium can absorb DNA directly from its environment, from dead cells, from other species, even from viruses that happen to be carrying useful code. Frederick Griffith discovered this in 1928 through his famous transformation experiments on Streptococcus pneumoniae at the British Ministry of Health's pathological laboratory. He killed a virulent strain with heat, mixed it with a harmless living strain, and then watched in astonishment as the harmless bacteria became deadly. They had absorbed genetic material from the dead cells, which meant information transferred without reproduction. 30 years later, in 1959, Japanese scientists documented antibiotic resistance jumping between completely different bacterial species, a phenomenon so strange they called it infectious heredity. Genes were spreading like rumors at a party. This explains how antibiotic resistance spreads at such a terrifying pace. One bacterium evolves resistance to methicillin, and within days that genetic advantage has been copied across millions of individuals who never evolved anything themselves. They just absorbed the winning code. TikTok runs on horizontal gene transfer, and the genes in this case are trends, sounds, formats, dances, jokes, and transition styles. When someone creates a video format that crosses quorum, whether it's the put a finger down challenge or a particular audio snippet or a specific comedic timing pattern, that successful genetic material gets absorbed by thousands of creators who had nothing to do with its origin. They don't have to be related to the original creator or be in the same niche or even know who created it. The information transfers horizontally and instantly across the entire ecosystem. This differs from how YouTube or traditional media operates at a fundamental level. YouTube's success remains mostly vertical because you build your channel, your audience, and your brand equity over time. Growth follows a genealogical pattern, where your videos are offspring of your channel's reputation, which means a video from a channel with 10 million subscribers has a massive advantage over an identical video from a new creator. The genetics are inherited. TikTok allows any creator to absorb the successful genetic material of any other creator and potentially outcompete the original. A creator with 0 followers can take a trending sound, apply it in a novel context, and end up with a video that gets 50 million views while the original gets 50,000. The format functions as the gene, and it transfers horizontally. The question shifts from who are your parents to what code did you absorb? This explains why TikTok trends spread faster than anything social media has ever seen. The mechanism goes beyond simple imitation to become transformation in the Frederick Griffith sense. Creators constantly sample environmental DNA and incorporate whatever proves viable. The third principle is phase variation, and this one explains why so many established creators failed when they tried migrating to TikTok. Something most people don't know about bacteria is that they don't have a single fixed identity. They carry multiple potential identities and switch between them based on environmental conditions, which microbiologists call phase variation. This is how organisms like Salmonella enterica survive unpredictable environments. The mechanism works elegantly through certain genes that have molecular switches capable of flipping, sometimes randomly and sometimes in response to specific signals, which causes the bacterium to express completely different surface proteins. One moment it presents cell type A to the environment, and the next moment it's showing cell type B. The underlying genetics stay the same, while the phenotypic expression changes completely. This lets bacterial populations hedge their bets across multiple strategies at once, with some bacteria in the colony expressing version 1 of a surface protein while others express version 12. When the environment shifts, some variant will already be pre-adapted to survive. Neisseria gonorrhoeae, the bacterium that causes gonorrhea, has mastered phase variation through a process called antigenic variation, which is the same principle that makes vaccine development so difficult. Your immune system learns to recognize variant A, but the bacterium has already switched to variant Q. This isn't evolution in the traditional Darwinian sense, but rather cycling through a pre-programmed library of identities based on which one suits current conditions. Casinos use this same principle when they constantly redesign floor layouts because environmental unpredictability rewards behavioral flexibility. Bacteria figured this out a billion years ago, Vegas figured it out in the 1960s, and TikTok creators are still catching up. The platform's architecture actively encourages phase variation in a way that Instagram and YouTube never did. Successful TikTok creators don't maintain a single fixed identity, but instead test multiple personas, formats, content, verticals, and posting rhythms at the same time. The algorithm rewards this flexibility, so when your cooking content isn't crossing QUORUM, you phase shift into relationship commentary. When that underperforms, you phase shift into storytime format. Same creator, different phenotypic expression, and the For You page doesn't care about your brand consistency. It only cares whether your current expression crosses threshold. Kaby Lame built the largest following on TikTok, over 160 million followers. Not through a traditional fixed identity content strategy, but through phase variation. He tested multiple formats, found that his wordless reaction videos achieved QUORUM consistently, then committed resources to that variation. But he maintains the capacity to shift because the organism stays flexible and the expressed identity remains conditional on environmental feedback. Mr. Beast built a YouTube empire using the opposite approach, relying on fixed identity through elaborate productions, consistent format, and recognizable brand. That strategy works brilliantly on platforms that reward vertical inheritance, where your channel reputation carries forward and your subscriber base receives new content automatically. Fixed identity struggles in phase variation environments, though, and when Mr. Beast posts on TikTok, he's not building on his YouTube genetics. Every video starts the QUORUM test from scratch because the platform doesn't care who your parents are. This explains the pattern of traditional creators failing during migration. YouTube stars and Instagram influencers brought their established phenotypes, their fixed cell surface proteins, and expected them to work in a new environment. TikTok's ecosystem rewards phase variation and rewards creators who can express different versions of themselves based on what the algorithm signals is viable right now. Fixed identity becomes a liability when the environment keeps shifting. The fourth principle, and this is the one that killed TikTok's competitors, is biofilm formation. Those slimy layers bacteria create on surfaces aren't just passive accumulation. Biofilms are highly organized structures where bacteria cooperate to create a microenvironment benefiting the collective. The biofilm produces an extracellular matrix, a scaffolding of sugars and proteins and DNA that protects all members from external threats, including antibiotics, immune cells, environmental stress, and competing species. Individual bacteria sacrifice some of their autonomy for the security of the collective structure. Bill Costerton's landmark 1978 paper called How Bacteria Stick at the University of Calgary launched an entire field studying these structures. What he found was counterintuitive. Bacteria in biofilms behave completely differently than free-floating planktonic bacteria. The quorum sensing dynamics change, resource distribution changes, and gene expression changes. A bacterium at the outer edge of a biofilm has a different metabolic profile than one embedded in the center, even though they're genetically identical, because the collective structure creates ecological niches that couldn't exist without it. Later research at Philip Stewart's Center for Biofilm Engineering at Montana State revealed that biofilm bacteria can resist antibiotics at up to 1,000 times the rate of their free-floating counterparts. The structure itself confers survival advantages that no individual bacterium could achieve alone, and the matrix provides infrastructure beyond simple protection. TikTok built a biofilm, and Instagram, along with YouTube and Snapchat, couldn't penetrate it. When TikTok entered the US market in 2018 through its merger with Musical LY, the lip sync app, founded by Alex Zhu and Lu Yu Yang, it inherited a small but existing community of creators who already had established relationships with each other and with the platform's norms. This was the initial attachment layer, the first bacteria adhering to a new surface. As new creators joined, they didn't enter an empty space, but instead attached to existing structures. Collaborations formed and duet chains emerged, and comment section communities developed their own languages, along with inside jokes and call and response patterns. What resulted was a protective matrix that made users resistant to switching platforms. TikTok didn't have better features than Instagram Reels or YouTube Shorts, and in many ways, the competition offered superior tools with better editing, better monetization, and better music licensing. But those platforms were asking users to abandon a biofilm for open water. The algorithmic feed, the creator relationships, the trend languages, and the collective memory of references all formed a protective structure that individuals didn't want to leave. Mark Zuckerberg reportedly told Meta employees that Reels was the company's top priority and directed massive resources toward competing with TikTok. Instagram launched Reels in August 2020 and offered substantial financial incentives through the Creator Fund to attract top creators. In biofilm terms, this resembled prescribing amoxicillin for a Pseudomonas aeruginosa infection, which is standard treatment for the wrong organism. The antibiotics killed surface bacteria, and some edge-dwelling creators took the money and cross-posted, but the core structure remained resistant. The matrix held, and the biofilm's center barely noticed. Quibi stands as the most expensive case study at $1.75 billion. Jeffrey Katzenberg and Meg Whitman raised that sum to launch a short-form video platform in April 2020, and they had Hollywood-quality content, experienced leadership, and massive capital. But they were launching individual bacteria into an environment where a mature biofilm already existed. Microbiologists call this colonization resistance, the phenomenon where resident microbial communities physically prevent newcomers from attaching to a surface. Quibi didn't fail because of content quality or pricing strategy, but because it couldn't attach. The surface was already colonized and the biofilm was already secreting matrix. 6 months later, Quibi was dead. Every attempt to build a TikTok killer has replicated this failure pattern. Triller came back by Ryan Kavanaugh, Byte came from Vine's original founder, YouTube Shorts came with all of Google's resources, and Instagram Reels came with Meta's billions of users. They all offered comparable functionality, and some offered better monetization, along with better creators and better production tools. None of them could replicate the biofilm, though, because they were trying to colonize a surface where the resident community had already built infrastructure. The competition was never between features, but between a protective community structure and isolated individuals landing in open water. Kevin Systrom understood this dynamic when he built Instagram. The early platform wasn't technically superior to other photo apps, since Hipstamatic had better filters and Camera Plus had better controls. Instagram formed a biofilm faster because users attached to each other's content and not just to the tool. Once that protective structure existed, competitors couldn't dislodge it no matter how superior their features were, and the biofilm held for a decade. Then TikTok built an even more robust matrix around a different content format. A dark side to these bacterial dynamics exists that no one in growth marketing wants to discuss. Bacteria that can't reach quorum don't grow slowly, but instead go dormant, sometimes permanently. In harsh environments, they can enter a state called VBNC, which stands for viable but non-culturable. They're alive but unable to reproduce or participate in the ecosystem, which makes them effectively invisible. TikTok's algorithm creates the same phenomenon. Creators who can't cross the engagement threshold in early testing don't just grow slowly, but disappear entirely. Their content never escapes the cold start phase, and they're visible to themselves but invisible to the ecosystem. The algorithm has no middle ground, no gradual build, and no slow accumulation of audience. You cross quorum or you don't exist. And this explains why TikTok's creator burnout rate exceeds every other major platform. The binary nature of quorum-based distribution creates constant existential pressure because every video represents a new viability test. Every post is a bacterium asking whether this environment is going to let me survive. What microorganisms have figured out that most content creators and platform builders and growth strategists still get wrong comes down to 4 points. Quorum sensing means you don't scale what isn't working. Every bacterium tests environmental viability before committing resources, and every piece of content should do the same. When your first few hundred viewers aren't engaging and your autoinducers aren't bouncing back at threshold levels, the environment isn't viable for that specific content. Don't force it and don't promote it and don't put money behind it. Test something else instead, because the algorithm is your autoinducer detection system. Use it as a signal rather than an obstacle. Horizontal gene transfer means your success doesn't have to be genetically original. The most successful bacteria aren't the ones that evolve new genes from scratch, but the ones that absorb useful genetic material from their environment fastest and express it in viable ways. The most successful creators aren't the ones who invent unprecedented formats, but the ones who absorb trending formats and adapt them to their unique context fastest. Stop trying to be purely original, because transformation beats invention. The question isn't whether you created this format, but whether you can express this genetic material in a way that crosses quorum. Phase variation means identity flexibility is a survival advantage. Bacteria that can express multiple phenotypes survive unpredictable environments, and creators who can shift formats and topics and presentation styles survive unpredictable algorithms. The question isn't who am I, but what version of me does this current environment reward? Locking into a fixed identity feels authentic, but in a phase variation environment, flexibility is what survives. Biofilm formation means community structure beats individual capability. The most antibiotic-resistant bacteria aren't the ones with the best individual defenses, but the ones embedded in the most protective collective structures. The most platform-resistant creators aren't the ones with the most followers, but the ones most embedded in collaborative networks, duet chains, comment section communities, and cross-creator relationships. Build your matrix, because your individual talent matters less than your structural position in the collective. What Bonnie Bassler at Princeton and Bill Costerton in Calgary figured out about bacterial ecology decades ago, and what platform engineers in Beijing and Silicon Valley are still learning, is that growth in competitive environments isn't about individual excellence, it's about collective dynamics operating at scale. Quorum sensing and horizontal gene transfer and phase variation and biofilm formation aren't separate principles, but all expressions of the same underlying truth. Distributed systems that test viability before committing, absorb successful patterns rapidly, maintain phenotypic flexibility, and build protective community structures will outcompete systems built on individual optimization, genetic originality, fixed identity, and solo operation. Next time you're creating content or building a product or trying to spread an idea through any networked environment, ask yourself what the bacteria would do. Would they commit resources before testing viability? Would they insist on genetic originality when transformation is faster? Would they lock into a fixed phenotype in an unpredictable environment? Would they operate alone when collective structures offer protection? The best viral content isn't built on marketing principles, but on microbial ecology principles. The growth playbook was written in pond water 4 billion years ago, and you just didn't have the vocabulary for it until now. Bacteria and social media platforms are two systems that seem to have nothing in common, with one measured in micrometers and milliseconds, and the other in global users and quarterly earnings reports. But the underlying dynamics of population growth and resource competition and viability testing and collective behavior connect everywhere, because the math is the same and only the substrate is different. That's what we do here. Find the hidden structures, linking fields nobody thought to connect. Want to see how fungal networks understand supply chain logistics better than Amazon's algorithms, or how termite mound architecture solved the ventilation problems killing modern skyscrapers? Subscribe, because next week we're covering why slime mold consistently outperforms Tokyo's civil engineers at designing rail networks, and what that means for your next product launch. Drop a comment about the most biofilm-like community you've ever been embedded in, the one that was almost impossible to leave even when objectively better alternatives existed. I want to hear what made the Matrix so sticky.